of receiving an email and 2 days later opening up and seeing who was on the agenda, and it was me, and my topic was UCI Bicycle rules. I just wanted to make a couple notes here what the rest of the world calls material. So you go lots of places and nobody ever calls it equipment, they call it material. And I want you to understand this is about understanding regulations for a UCI legal bicycle, or why I thought it was just a bike, since it's a little confusing. So we've got some objectives today, and the reason we've got some objectives here is just so that you feel like you've gotten something out of this, but as well to understand that how we think about a bicycle is not how the rest of the world thinks about a bicycle. Now, I say that based on my own experience and my own perspective, but quite frankly, the UCI has some very unusual concepts about what the bicycle is and should be, and it's different from how we were, quote unquote, raised in the sport. So it's a little bit different. Understanding the key regulations governing bicycles, understanding what's now called the UCI label and non-standard wheels program, both of which are approval programs. Understand a new equipment approval process, and understand when we actually care about these regulations. As you know, we don't have that many UCI calendar races, and there's also lots of differences when these regulations get applied. So I'm going to jump into that. If anybody has ever heard the phrase Lugano Charter, there's nothing terribly special about that, except it was a meeting in Lugano, and they talked about bicycles. So it's become known as the Lugano Charter, and I've put up some bullet points there that kind of satirically suggest what it is they were trying to accomplish. It should look like your famous Belgian hero's bicycle. If it doesn't look like Eddie Merckx, there must be something wrong with it. It should stop bizarre forms and riding positions. So if anybody remembers Chris Boardman's monocoque frame, Graham Obree laying over the top of something that was constructed from a washing machine, that's not what they want. Finally, on the serious level, the principle of man over machine. In other words, the entire image is important, and the principle of people competing on fairly equitable devices is important, so that the final result is that it's a man against man, woman against woman sport. This is from the Lugano Charter. The UCI wishes to recall that the real meaning of cycle sport is to bring riders together to compete on an equal footing and thereby decide which of them is physically the best. Obviously, if people have paid attention to equipment like I have over the years, understand that there's lots of advantages to be gained. And quite frankly, the last Olympics was really a demonstration of what has been gained in micro advantages, just absolutely small shavings of time and energy that are expended by athletes to create their best results. So principal bicycle regulations, and we're talking here from a UCI perspective. You know, if you were to ask somebody about what a bicycle should be, they're going to relate that it's got two wheels and pedals and those kinds of things. But they want to make this kind of codified, let's put it that way. So it has to be comfortable and maneuverable. Well, anybody that sat on a bicycle seat the first week that they were riding a bicycle would probably argue that comfortable really wasn't there, but anyway, maneuverable. Two wheels, equal diameter is important. We used to have events where bikes could have different size wheels, generally in a seated position, front wheel steerable, rear wheel drive, pedals in a chain, powered by the legs and feet, in a circular motion, and then 3 points of support, assuming you don't count your feet twice. So you want to be able to use your hands, your rear end, and your feet in control of the bicycle, sitting on the bicycle. Some continuation on that is no fairings. In other words, you can't have devices that reduce wind resistance of the individual components other than the components themselves. No mechanical assistance, no cancellara devices. Stored energy, battery-powered motors. There were a number of inventions that were put on the market where as a wheel would rotate, a weight would compress a spring on the spokes and release some kind of energy or help store energy. Lots of kind of unusual things have happened over the years. It's supposed to be commercially available. The idea is access to the sport. Is it something that everybody can go out and do? Can they understand it? Now, if anybody watched the Olympics, most of the things, for instance, on the track, it looked pretty much like a track bike that you've seen in the last 10 or 15 years. What you don't know is that the British handlebars on the team sprint cost 35,000 pounds a piece to construct. Now, is that really commercially available? I'm not too sure. Is it really access to the sport? I'm not sure. I happen to serve on the UCI's Materials Commission, and one of the decisions that they made was that getting something on the market isn't as easy as getting it approved, getting it manufactured, and then, let's say the 1st of January, you start selling it, everybody starts using it. Because there's always some type of use of the equipment, development of the equipment. So that pre-approval takes about 6 months to go through that process. So the idea of having something on the market within 9 months is a reflection of understanding of it's got to get introduced, and more than likely that's going to be at a World Tour team level, so people will get interested in it and it'll be out on the market. Now the problem is there's no teeth in that. There's no way to go back and actually verify date of release of something that's at a reasonable price, so it's actually quite a big loophole. The final issue is no testing and competition. So they don't want somebody to say, hey, we just pulled this thing off the carbon fiber mold. We'd like to stick it on your bike, and we'd like you to go ride down a hill and see what happens, but we'd like you to do that in the middle of a world-famous event at the same time. So they don't want to do that. Key regulations, this is from the UCI about what they consider to be a bike. I'm not going to actually read all this stuff, but this is in the regulations talking about the basic dimensions of a bicycle. Does anybody know if this is the same as our regulations for bicycle dimensions? It's not quite. We have a little bit more fuzzy thinking that bikes could be a little wider, a little longer, and try to deal with tandems all in the same definition, etc. But again, this is really just the basic issues. This bottom paragraph here is really about understanding what bike is used where, because bikes measure differently for different events. How many people here have worked the track? Okay. How many people have worked just a general road race? Okay, for the track people, how many times have you measured a bike? All the time, every event. Road races, how many of you have measured a bike at a road race? At a road race, just the road race. Okay, good. How many of you done it at a time trial? Okay, so basically the emphasis is on aerodynamics, specific setup, especially in time trial events. So quite honestly, there's a lot of illegal equipment that's being used in road races. There's a lot of bikes that are too light. There's a lot of bikes that the saddles don't really comply with this theory of where it should be, including its level. But quite honestly, it's just not checked. As long as something just isn't bizarre looking, it generally just gets by until it's a time trial. So how do we ensure that a bicycle is a bicycle and really a bicycle? It's about dimensions. I had a little joke about, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and sounds like a duck, it is a duck. Well, a bicycle, you really don't know that until you measure the thing. I just made a note here, this 1.3.011 through 18 has all the dimensions of a bicycle. And if you're a tech nut and you want to go look at that stuff, you're going to be amazed at how many things you can measure on a bicycle. Tom Nee related one year at the Tour de France. He was asked to measure a bicycle at the last moment, and so he basically had about 6 or 7 dimensions that he verified. Now back then it was about how wide are the forks, rear triangle, and a few other things. They hadn't quite done all of this setup. Now to exhaustively check a bicycle, it takes a huge effort, and to actually verify everything about a bicycle, it actually takes a computerized image system that the Chinese use to fabricate most everything in the world. So you basically take a picture of it and you start reproducing it. There's a little bit of difference in where you use it. Road competitions, and again, the way the UCI writes things is sometimes quite awkward, the way the French translates to English. So for road competitions other than time trials, and for cyclocross competitions, so in other words, road competitions, cyclocross competitions, except time trials, the frame of the bicycle should be on a traditional pattern. That is built around a main triangle, constructed with straight or tapered tube elements and rear triangles forming a chain stay, seat stay, and a seat tube. So essentially double triangle construction is what you're looking for. So when we get into time trials, so road time trials, track competitions. Now, be aware that that's track competitions, not just track time trials. The elements of the bicycle frame, they're basically assembled or cast in a single piece or in any form, including arches, cradles, beams, and others. So it can be of quite varying shape, although it's still looking for a double triangle construction. That's why when you look at, probably if you go and look at some of these photographs, you look at a track bike, even if it's a mass start event, it's going to look a little bit, I'll just call it sexier. It's got more curves, more angles, more swoops on it than a general road bike does. Component controls are really critical. Has anybody here, has most everybody here done jig measurements? Show of hands really quickly. Okay, we've got a few people, so if you haven't done it, please ask somebody if you haven't seen one before. I have an entire another presentation on that, which we won't do. But you're trying to verify a number of key points and verify that something is legal for riding. If it's not, there's exceptions, and I'm not going to go into all that. That's about doing the bike measurements themselves. So you're talking about your crank, your saddle, handlebars, and wheel relationships. Those are your most important keys about how you're checking it. Your crank center is ground zero. That's the point where all these measurements start to happen. Other measurements happen from front wheel axles, et cetera, but your basic overall dimensions that most of us do are about the crank. So the saddle nose, or they call it the peak of the saddle, but the nose of the saddle has to be 5 centimeters behind that crank. Time trials, when we put an extension on the front of the bike, is 75 centimeters beyond that point. Again, there's also a morphological exception for that. Drop handlebars fit into a box that's defined by the top of the tires. And this is a very odd one, why they didn't choose the center of the stem, but essentially the back of the stem or the back of the head tube is forming a triangle, or excuse me, a shape that you can fit handlebars into and over the top of the wheel. Who thinks that might be a problem for some types of bikes? Small frames for women, juniors, often have a hard time actually making that handlebar fit in that space. So those are some of the things that come up. So again, this is a very quick diagram. We're just showing you how the UCI looks at this. They've got this diagram in the rule books. You can go through each one of those points, find that article number, and go find out what that measurement is supposed to be. Quite honestly, we really worry about, where the crank is, where the saddle is, and if it's behind that. If it's not, there's a morphological exception, and how far forward would be extension for a time trial bar. Most people don't know this, and it's never checked, that there is basically the front handlebars here have a 5 centimeter tolerance in basically being at the front axle. It also changes for sprint competitions. That's much greater distance there that you can use. These are just very minor things. Just showing you very quickly a few things here. Again, this big red arrow is here talking about that 5 centimeter setback. If not, there's a morphological issue. You essentially have this level plane over the top of the wheels that starts to define the shape that the handlebars can be in. Again, the top of the saddle forms the top of that, and as long as your handlebars are in that position. A lot of times we get new athletes in the sport riding a triathlete bike, especially at national championships, may have bars that are way up above the top of the saddle. So the idea is to keep it in that zone there. So again, very quick information for you. Again, as we post this stuff, it'll certainly be available so you can take a look at it. Wheels, we've got some basic dimensions that we're concerned about. Again, we tend to check those on a jig if we're going to check them. You obviously know if it looks too big or too small. Does anybody remember Moser riding the really large rear wheel time trial bike with a very small front wheel? That's basically where all this started to change and happen. I'm going to just jump really back to the first portion. We talked about accessibility to the sport. USA Cycling in 1996, home country, looking for medals, which typically happens to the host country. They typically get more medals. We went nuts. We enlisted some manufacturers to help us develop what's called the Project 96, or the Superbike, which is out in one of the display cases out here. Now, the problem was we were really proud of that, and so we started talking to the press, and we started to reveal that we'd spent $12 million designing the bikes for the pursuits. And we basically had our hats handed to us by 4 guys who got off the Tour de France from France, got on bikes and kicked our rear ends. So we spent $12 million on it, talked about it, and came up with nothing. We had small front wheels so that the bikes could ride closer together. We had incredibly narrow frame components, very aerodynamic shapes, but it really got us nothing. So in that process, they said, look, we've got to pull this back. It can't be an arms race and how much money you can spend. Have they solved that? Absolutely not. But bikes look more like bikes nowadays. In other words, it's a little bit more understandable to the public. Back to wheels. Standard design, everybody knows what that is. It's an old box rim. There's some minimum dimensions on that. It has to have 16 spokes. And if you can ride one of those and it breaks, nobody cares, because it's a standard wheel. Nobody must have died, so it must be okay. If you're going to ride cool wheels, that's stuff that you see every day at just about every race around, especially if it's a UCI event, you have to have a wheel that's been UCI approved, which means that they have sent that model in. They've done a rupture test on it, which is essentially slamming it into something about the size of a curb with some pre-described force. And if it breaks and expels spokes, the rim, anything that's a sharp projectile, it doesn't pass. That's the only test that they do for it. I apparently have caused problems because I said, why would we only test that? Because the biggest problem is carbon wheels tend to fold over sideways. They fold like a pretzel and they snap right back up, and the guy gets back on and rides them, and then he crashes on the next descent. So they're actually talking about doing all wheels and introducing that within the next 2 years. So they'll be looking at a bunch more tests. At the bottom here, this is just a header. If you go online to the UCI's website, www.uci.ch, go to the right-hand side, look below regulations and all that sort of stuff. There's a section called material. You go onto that page, you're going to have to do a little bit of searching, but you will find non-standard wheels in conformity with the article 1.3.018, and it's updated all the time. Just because you've looked at it once does not mean it's updated. It is always being updated. It's one of those things, if you were ever at a UCI event and you had to check something, you better have a mobile device because it probably changed between the day you got on a plane and the point that you got there.
Do they have stickers?
These wheels do not have stickers. They are talking about a labeling program, and I'll get into that when we talk about the frames, to try to solve that conundrum of how you figure that out. I have suggested that they do this with both frames and wheels, which is to have the name of the product with a picture of a product. In other words, look at the labels that the manufacturer puts on it. It's much easier to identify. And I do know that I'm rushing here. We'd like to be able to get through this and be able to give you some questions as well. And what I'm giving you is not something you need to memorize, but it's something that you should probably be aware of. Give yourself a chance to study it and look at it later. The UCI frame label program is something that they're trying to resolve. Let me just jump back there. They're trying to resolve us having to figure this out in the minute and a half that a rider wants to give you the bike before they start the time trial. So with the UCI label program, they're essentially checking all of that. So if a bike makes it through the UCI label program, verification program, when that bike shows up at a UCI event with that UCI label on it, it says that it meets all those dimensions that you should have checked, have 1,000 questions on. How do you measure this? How do you measure that? That means it's all been taken care of. A couple caveats here. It was established in 2011, was the first year, and they decided that anybody that had anything in production, because carbon fiber molds are quite expensive. Again, the concept was this must be all about carbon fiber, and it's now backfired in the terms of the steel frames, standard tubular frames. But if it was in production in 2011, they were going to allow that into the program, as long as the bike is still valid. Now, the UCI's mentality quite often is Eurocentric and professional-centric. Therefore, they believe that any bike that was on the market for more than 2 years would be gone and we would never see it again. Well, I can tell you as an official who goes to South America, you as well, Bruce, is that that's where they all end up. And they'll be there for another 10 years, and we'll have to continue to deal with the fact that a lot of them are illegal. So once this program got started, UCI approved it in 2012. They had to have the labels. It's now in the regulations as a mandatory label program for all World Tour teams in 2013. They've already sent out the letter that there are people that are accepted from that because they said, oh, by the way, we're still using the same mold for the 2011 Specialized Shiv now. Anybody believe that? I don't. But anyway, that's what their story is, and so the UCI has granted an exception. So again, it creates new layers of confusion because now you not only have this direct policy, direct regulation, now you get in the field and you find out that you now have 3 or 4 pages of exceptions and other memos you have to look at. Again, the label, if anybody ever shows you a label and says it's got a UCI label on it, the only thing that's labeled right now are frames, forks are next, and nothing else is labeled. So if somebody has a UCI label on a set of handlebars, they're probably covering holes, and just take it off. Over here, this gives the manufacturer's abbreviation and model number, and then RD, TK, in other words, road, track, etc. So you have an idea what that is supposed to be. Again, here's pictures of labels down here that they've said aren't correct. And the points that are really to be made here is it makes the frame dimensionally compliant only, and it does not assure how the rider is set up on the bike, whether the components are in the right place, and whether it is actually going to be legal to ride yet. Approved frames, again, this is a snapshot of the list of approved frames. Again, it is updated very frequently. And what I just found out in my last commission meeting, which was last Thursday, was that a new model bike had been approved by one of the Pro Tour teams, and they basically withheld. They've had the bike approved for almost 3 months, but they didn't request the approval and put it on the website until just before they unveiled it at their big professional race. So the fact that you may have seen something in the field, people training on it, et cetera, doesn't mean it's actually been finalized, and it's not until it actually shows up on this list. Again, the same thing, the UCI website, right side, material, and then look down on this to find this page. But this has every model of every bike that's been approved. As we all know, at the professional level, lots of times riders have bikes that are made by other companies, but they've got other information on them. There's now a very strict procedure of relabeling. So if you see somebody riding a bike, if you get to be at a national commissaire at a big race, and there's somebody who presents a time trial bike that you know is actually manufactured by Giant and has specialized stickers on it, there is a real strict relabeling program where the manufacturers have to allow each other to not only relabel but repaint the bikes. So they're trying to control some of that and not just have false information out there. You'll notice here that they have, oops, I'm going to go back really quick. They do have the new fork sticker showing there. And again, this has a frame sticker. It's got a little frame symbol on it that has a little fork symbol on it. So they will be doing that so that now what used to happen is a rider would show up. We had no idea whether or not the fork was still approved for that frame. So somebody could swap out a fork, could make the wheelbase shorter, could make it illegal. We wouldn't know that unless we sat down and did extensive measurements. So when you get one of these bikes at the line, these are the pictures of the stickers. Generally, the location is supposed to be on top. You're not supposed to have to turn the bike upside down and over like a puppy to figure out if it's a boy or a girl. You're supposed to be able to see the label. So you can see there, that's a Cervelo label. They're P5 and a TT model. One of the things, again, I've encouraged them to do is give us a name and a picture, because they've reminded everybody that the specialized shiv is still legal. However, there's 2 specialized shivs on the market. One is a time trial model for UCI racing, and the other is for triathlon. Triathlon model is not legal. This is, again, something you can download from the UCI website. They've got the very large PowerPoint, essentially in PDF now, that I can forward to people, that goes through all the issues that we're supposed to be checking, or is checked on, or is looked at on a bicycle. I'm going to go through some general equipment regulations. There's a 3-to-1 ratio for aerodynamic purposes. So if anybody looks at a Prius, that's basically the standard aerodynamic shape that is, I don't remember the scientist that kind of developed the entire principle, but you know how the back of a Prius is kind of snub-nosed? Basically, you could actually continue that line, and there's diminishing returns in the aerodynamic value of that shape. UCI set a 3-to-1 ratio to limit really bizarre shapes and really long shapes. So originally, the Project 96 bikes, those were illegal because they have a ratio that's greater than 3-to-1. Handlebars also have to do this. Handlebars can't be super flat for time trials. We've been doing it over the past number of years, actually allowing people to put some tape on it. Why do we do that? It's a customer service experience. You've got a junior coming to an international stage race for the first time. They may not have any idea. Now, the intention is to make that bike comply with the aerodynamic values. Quite frankly, between you and me, if you put duct tape on a bike and put some popsicle sticks on it to make it come up to 3-to-1, do you think it's as aerodynamic efficient as a really nicely designed one? No. Does it comply? Yes. But they say don't modify things. So at the World Tour, you're not going to see anything modified. At a lower event, you certainly may see something done like that as an exceptional decision by the commissaires. Water bottles, aerodynamic water bottles, now have to meet the 3-to-1 ratio as well. It's a very complicated diagram coming up about where that's measured. I'm not going to worry about it unless it just really looks silly or it's filling in the bottom of a frame like on a Cervelo P4. No modification of the manufacturer's approved design. So has anybody read in Velo News where, some mechanic sets up a pro rider's bike and they talk about drilling the frame because they routed the cable a certain way? Absolutely illegal. It essentially voids the entire warranty of the bike, and it voids the approval process of the UCI. Do I check it? No, but just understand that basically if the manufacturer didn't intend for them to do internal routing and drill holes in the frame, then basically the people who are using it have made it illegal. You can't cover holes with tape. You can't trim stuff off. So who was at the Nationals about 2 or 3 years ago where we were trimming shivs with a Dremel to make them legal? Yeah. So here we really violated the real regulation, which is don't modify a frame. Yeah, so it's pretty bizarre. No covering holes with tape for aerodynamic advantage. I was the asshole at the Vuelta that made Alberto Contador's mechanic take all the tape off all the holes over his bike. But if the manufacturer makes a little rubber plug or cover, then you can certainly use that. This also applies to saddles. People started using grip tape on saddles because where do people actually ride on a saddle? Very tip. So then people started putting all sorts of weird tape on it, and then it had to be a manufacturer's product. You couldn't just put any kind of tape on it. No removal of wheel retention tabs or the lawyer tabs. Who's going to check it? I don't know. If somebody comes up to me at a UCI race and says, look, I fell off my lawyer tabs, can I ride? I'm going to say no. So the point being is probably don't ask, don't tell at the moment. We'll see. UCI says they're going to check it. I just came back from the World Tour Commissaires meeting, and we all agreed mutually that none of us were going to do it. So if the UCI wants to do it, they can send their Material Equipment Commission to take a lot of grief at an event and check them. And they probably will at the tour. Yes?
Covering the holes with tape, the hole on a disc wheel where the valve stem is?
That's the only exception. The only exception is basically covering a disc wheel valve cover. That's the only place it is allowed. So it goes back to the same thing. Helmets, shoes, anything that's not designed that way, then it's actually not allowed to do that. They're illegal, yeah. No fairings, cowlings, disc covers. In other words, you can't have wheels that just simply have a cover over the top of the wheel. However, I can tell you that the UCIs actually, in the name of accessibility, are starting to consider approving essentially a manufactured disc cover. So it'll be a much less expensive disc wheel. That's essentially a spoked wheel that will end up with a manufacturer's cover being assembled as part of that process. So I think that's actually a big advancement for them. No, goodness. Sorry that's all gray. So you can't modify your equipment for any reason. We used to see people cutting the tips of saddles off because they couldn't get it to go far enough back. Go to South America, that saddle's probably rusted. You're not moving it, but something has to change to make it legal, so people are actually cutting them off. Again, this is the issue on rubber plugs, etc. So I won't go through that there. It's a little bit boring there. It's all great. But essentially, don't modify your equipment. That doesn't make it legal. What makes it legal is buying equipment that is legal in the first place. I probably got too many slides in there. So here's a couple quick examples. You've got somebody building up a handlebar to make it comply. This is one that was very flat. Quite honestly, this person is a greater disadvantage complying with the rules in this manner, but that's not what they want. Lawyer tabs obviously still being available. Some of these devices, you can see a lot of holes are taped up there. And then a lot of devices on bikes, the manufacturers will call them structural. But quite honestly, they're just covers. They're covering up cables, or they're making a more gentle curve between two components. And they're trying to really watch closely for that and make sure that that's not being used. Again, that last one, is your saddle with tape put all over the top of it. Oh, there. Okay, so that's how it's coming through. What do you know? Tom must have played with this. Since I don't know how to do it. Saddle horizontality is something that came up last year, and we were all screamed out loudly by the riders. I was handed medical certificates from doctors saying the guy was going to get prostate cancer if he rode the bike like that. And the worst case was at a World Cup for paracycling, somebody said that they had pictures of an absent perineum of a patient that I could look at if I was not going to allow them to change or leave the saddle as it was. And I said it was really quite okay. We would not have to examine the photos, and they could have a tipped saddle. What the UCI is worried about as scientists, and sometimes scientists and engineers kind of get in the way of what we call Fingerspitzgefühle, do you actually understand what's going on, is they decided that in triathlons, they were starting to tilt the saddles down so that the rider could push back against it, essentially what they call lumbar support. Therefore, they said a saddle couldn't be any more than 3 degrees. The original definition was a saddle had to be horizontal. So we all looked at it and said, yep, where that rider sits looks horizontal, good for me. They said, no, we now need to measure it. The most amusing part of this was somebody set up this demonstration, and I got a frantic call from the UCI's equipment coordinator, says, we need to find a scale like this. So I simply took another photograph, enlarged it. It's essentially from Sears and Roebuck. So I said, well, I could get you those pretty easily. Anyway, they've modified it, put a magnet on the bottom, slapped it on a large steel plate, covers the saddle, and they check that. Now, the tolerance on this particular level is actually quite good, and they want the regulation is 2.5 degrees, and they'll give us a 0.5 degree for tolerance, therefore 3 degrees. You can see here, this one is at 2 degrees, that one's at 4 degrees, therefore it's illegal. The worst part about this is they decided to set this up. I was a dissenting vote in saying you really can't set up a regulation until you tell the manufacturers how you're going to measure it. They just said, well, we're picking the highest point front and back of the saddle, drawing a straight line, and therefore that's how we'll measure it. So if anybody's ridden one of these saddles before, the scientist version of a level saddle is that, and that's actually what the rider would like to be sitting on. Now you can see this is a very dramatic shape, which actually does provide some lumbar support, which is really why it drew attention in the first place. But lots of the Sella Italia versions have quite a bit of swoop in them, and despite my efforts to demonstrate it with all my old bicycles, they didn't really care. So flat saddles win, and your maximum dimension or your level angle is 3 degrees. So again, it's taken from front and back, just like when a rider comes to your time trial and says, but I'm tall, you have to give me more distance for my setup for arms or whatever else. Yes, I can see you're tall. Yes, I can see your saddle has funny shapes. The regulation is still, we measure it from the top, highest points front and back. We've got some new updates for bottles. Again, bottles were becoming a way for the manufacturers to get past compliance in how big the joints between shapes could be. Obviously, the bigger the solid infill, the more aerodynamic value it had. Therefore, we started seeing all sorts of aerodynamic bottles. I actually pulled bottles off of bikes last year. I believe it was in Utah. They were doing how long was the hill climb in Utah last year? Do you remember, Chuck? I can't remember now. It was a shorter one. It was a really short time. It must have been the prologue. 2 years ago? Yeah. Prologue, yeah. Quite short, but everybody showed up with aerodynamic water bottles. It's like, really? And the best part was most everybody was riding their road bikes because only the specialists had their time trial bikes, and we found most of the road bikes were illegal. They were too light. So what did we do? Filled up water bottles and put them back on the bike. Made them go up the hill with a little bit more weight. So got maximum dimensions. If you're really interested in reading this stuff, I'd be happy to send it to you. If you're that interested in it, God help you, but it's about where it's measured, how wide it is, et cetera, and it talks about its capacity. I've had people show up at time trials with empty bottles, and I've actually asked them to put water in it as let's be reasonable about this. If it's on your bike as a water bottle, it ought to carry something. If it's on your bike simply to give you a better aerodynamic profile, then I don't think you should use it. So this is trying to define that so that we can get rid of some of those shapes. People quit trying to use it. And you can't integrate the bottle into the frame anymore. So just like with a wheel test where you slip a credit card between the wheel and the frame, especially if it's got an enclosed section that could become a fairing, they want bottles to be the same as well. So in other words, if somebody has a bottle on the bike and that bottle, especially as you see here, it starts to overlap the edge of the frame, it starts to become a complete system and cover, that changes the size and shape of that particular aerodynamic shape. And they don't want that. And again, there in the middle, the P4 made a fantastic bottle, which really created a really good shape, which really helped the aerodynamics of that bike. You can only put bottles in the interior triangle, the main triangle of the bike. You can't put them up on the handlebars. You can't put it behind the seat. It's got to be in those inside the triangle of the bike. So those are some of the new rules in terms of bottles. Okay, so everybody see the big red up there? Not now. This is just new information that's coming out. It'll be released for next year, but just so that you know about it, we had a lot of problems the last couple of years in defining how you would hold on to a pair of aerodynamic handlebars. And they started fussing about arms being level, then it was the bars had to be level, and then they figured out if the bars were level, then the arms could be at a different position. And the real genesis of this was what we called the praying Landis, Floyd Landis bike position that he used, pulling the handlebars really up, getting into essentially a ski tuck position, so that you're not only extending your hands, but you're also now starting to use your arms as a fairing in your position. So we've pretty much gotten it taken care of such that we're really checking riders to make sure that their arms are level, and that's what we'll continue to do this year, which means the bars have some tolerance. Every time a rider tells you, I don't ride with my arms on that part of the bars, it's too bad. That's going to be the highest point that they're going to grab, and you're going to check their arm level. So to try to get around that, they've decided to define a box that is 10 centimeters above or below, essentially, the forearm rest point. So the handlebars and the hands and the arms, as long as they fit inside that box, can go up or down any way you want. So it'll actually make our jobs much easier, but again, that's next year. So I'm sure we're going to have to come up with a new jig for that.
So the bars being level doesn't apply?
Won't apply next year. Yeah, next year, as long as it fits inside that 20 centimeters, arms and bars. When you think about that, it's a pretty small dimensional area. It should all come out pretty much the same. Unfortunately, I don't understand why they do things like this. They always like to introduce things slowly. For me, it makes sense with equipment that has to be modified or purchased or, is now in stock and being sold and can't be used. However, they decided that after years of study, they basically found that everybody gets on a bike for a time trial has a morphological exception. Duh. A couple of years ago, they closed a loophole that didn't ever quite say it, but they only wanted us to have one morphological exception, either for the extended handlebars or for the forward saddle. We got that taken care of. So now that they've understood all this, they've said next year, again, why we're not going to apply it now, I'm not sure, but anyway, next year, you can choose one of the two morphological exceptions and never have to be verified. Remember what we used to do? Put the rider on the bike, check to make sure that the forearms didn't make an angle greater than 120 degrees, or check that the saddle was forward of that minus 5 centimeter position relative to bottom bracket, and then we would check the vertical position of the forward knee. So all of that is going away. Next year, they'll just be able to choose whichever one they want. So we'll have to be ready for that so that we're not enforcing something that no longer exists. So again, you can choose one of the others. The other change that's happening here is the conundrum of how you measure a shifter. I've got a couple of images in here I can get to, but a couple of years ago, Dot and James Abbott put together a presentation on using the jig, and they actually did a lot of photographing. Where are you measuring a handlebar extension to? We sent that to the UCI and actually got them to give us a judgment call on that, which has become the de facto standard for the last number of years. At this point in time, if it's what's called a manual shifter, in other words, you shift it and the shifter stays in that position, you can measure it to the axis of the shifter. In other words, its pivot point, that's where you measure it to. If it's what they called return, they used to call it return to horizontal until I officiated an event and caused a big problem. So if you had, for instance, a SRAM system that you shifted and then the shifter returns to the exact same position, you would measure it from the front, no longer from the axis. The problem was that looks exactly like last year's model, which was a manual shifter. So once I told people how we were going to measure them, they said, well, by the way, I can actually set this up to point down or to point up. Well, it no longer returned to horizontal now, did it? So we were measuring from the end. The UCI stopped that last year, and then they said, we're going to put an end to that completely, which means now all shifters, regardless of what type, manual, return to center, return anyway, electronic, etc., will just be measured to the end of the shifter. So that will make it easier for us, so expect a whole new wave of shifter systems to come out next year. People will be figuring out a way to make them button shifters and whatever else so that they're not actually throwing the levers and actually having to measure the end of them. Quite honestly, if you think about any shifter on the market, you're going to lose almost 5 centimeters immediately if you have to measure to the end of that. Now, what we do know is that on a shifter return, auto return shifter, is if you put too much weight on it, it shifts, right? So nobody wants to hold those. If you use a manual shifter, they're very stiff and you can put your hands over the end of them and the bike doesn't change gears. That never quite caught them as logic, but anyway, that's what we're going to be doing now. Where does all this apply? Obviously, UCI calendar events. So now that you have all this knowledge, don't make yourself a nuisance and pester the heck out of the UCI International Commissaire that's at the event saying, aren't you going to check, aren't you going to check, aren't you going to check, because they probably aren't. They may. If there's a time trial, they're certainly going to go through all the relevant things that need to be checked, but there are a lot of things here that apply specifically to UCI calendar events. For USA cycling events, this is our regulation, 1I1, starting with E. We have to meet them for certain events, which would be national championships, especially events that are qualifying for international competition where there's a selection. They're going to be using them. So, does anybody want to? I'll just do it because I know we don't. I'm not. Everybody who's not mic'd here, but 17 to 18. In the rest of the world, those are the only juniors that exist. So we call our riders juniors at all different ages, but the rest of the world at 17, 18. So that's why that's there. U23 and Elite. We don't do it for masters right now in certain events. Now the conundrum there is, especially living in Colorado Springs, we have lots of masters track competitions. People come here to do records. So they can bring any bike they want and they can compete. They just can't compete and set a record. So the real problem is some guy who doesn't really think much of his fitness comes out and busts a world record, and we find out his bike isn't legal. We can't approve it. So we've tried to set up a whole system of courtesy bike checks. It makes it quite difficult to manage an event when people are half complying and half of them aren't complying. But anyway, this is where we're applying them. We've had several instances in the U.S. where people from outside the country come into the U.S. and start applying UCI rules, not even understanding that we don't actually follow all of those regulations for our events. So that's something you can certainly be in charge of as far as understanding where things are used so that you don't let those kind of problems actually happen. So our summary, UCI's philosophy of the bicycle is about appearance, controlled setup and use, and it's pre-approved. Key regulations are equal-sized wheels, double diamond frames. There's less control in terms of the shape and appearance for time trial and track bikes. The seat and handlebar positions, saddle and arm position are all critical issues, and the famous 6.8 kilograms. Can a bike be lighter than that? Yes. Open the front page of any bicycle magazine and you'll find one. I'm still having a lot of arguments with UCI about why in their testing of a frame, the whole reason for testing frames, I should say, was that they were worried about cheap bikes coming out of China and bikes, breaking in the middle of large events. So what do? They set up a labeling program to certify frames. What do they check? Dimensions. Nothing else, period. So when you buy that new frame that weighs about 700 grams, which is that portion of that weight, as long as you put a bunch of other stuff on that bike, it'll be safe. That's the message. They're starting to get the point, but that's where that comes from. Understanding UCI label and non-standard wheel programs, basically these things are being tested, and they are going through their process and being set out on the website so that you have the ability to look at that and make a decision. If you're going to a UCI event and you're going to be assigned to help doing something, avail yourself of those things so that you understand it. Understanding the new equipment approval, nothing just happens. It has to go through a procedure. Available to market within 9 months after the approval. That's not your problem, but it has to get submitted to a material committee. So if somebody comes up with an idea that's new, it has to go there. Does anybody want to know what the last approval was, the last innovation that came into cyclocross last year? Disc brakes, okay? Probably be in road racing within another year. So that's what they're starting to understand and care about now. Where do we care about these regulations? UCI calendar events. We have the exceptions for our riders under 17 and masters, but not for records. So those are some very quick points for you. And just want to credit Dot and James for their work initially, because UCI has ripped that off completely. They're using photographs and dimensions and everything within that. And then Matthew Motte is the current UCI Materials Commission leader. The employee, Julian Caron, was the one that started the label program and took all the heat for the last 2.5, 3 years. I think that's it. there are any general questions, I can certainly entertain them. If you want to talk about something afterwards, we can certainly do that as well. But I know we're ready for break. Chuck?
Can you hear me? There we go. What's the latest with the GoPro situation? Because we want to put them on at California. What's the latest you've heard? GoPro cameras on bikes.
So the sarcastic view is that the UCI wants to make money off of it, and they haven't figured out how to do that yet. But no, at this point, nothing is allowed on that. They formed a working commission, interestingly, of people who aren't trying to use it, as opposed to people who are trying to put it into production. But right now, they won't allow it on the bike. They're calling it a safety issue, although many brackets and devices have all been developed for that. They're starting to study what they believe the legal ramifications are, but quite honestly, it's about how they're going to actually push this into television and have commercial rights. So no, it's not going to happen this year. Exactly. Anybody else? Questions? James?
Well, it may be obvious, but I think the tightening up the regulation where everything has to be behind that 80 centimeters is going to be a big problem in enforcement for our taller riders next year.
I would agree, because everybody's going to come up and say I'm tall, and I'm simply going to say I know. But you know,
I mean, is there going to be a pushback? Do you think? I mean,
absolutely.
they're like you mentioned, they're going to lose several centimeters, and we're going to run up against.
No, I would agree, and I think it's important for us to push this information out, especially anybody that's working at an NRC event where we're going to actually apply these regulations. It needs to be illustrated. I'm happy to help with that. Some of the stuff that you guys produced as well, I believe, has some electronic shifter pictures. If you don't have it, I do.
I think it's going to push
Yep.
a lot of people to electronic because that's the one that has the best advantage.
Exactly. But yeah, it is going to be a problem, and I would suggest that, as we've done the last couple of years, the first NRC races of the year, we're letting people know that it's a problem. Quite honestly, my colleague Wayne Pomario from Canada is known as a super finer. He likes to fine everybody for everything, but he had a really good solution last year when a lot of people showed up with illegal equipment. He just gave them a small fine and let them ride it. But basically, the point was, if you're going to keep riding it, you're going to keep getting fined, or eventually you're going to be banned from using it.
Didn't you say once these new rules are initiated, they're allowed one of those morphological exceptions?
Next year, they'll be allowed either of those. But
They can choose to have one of the bars and say that's their exception.
they can have that exception up to 80 centimeters, which is really not very much.
Well, only up to 80.
Yeah.
There's still
There's a maximum distance that they can choose for that. Anybody else? Again, I have a ton of material. If people are interested in looking at it, I can, a lot of this stuff is on the website, but I can also push other memos and information to you. Some of it's interesting me reading, other of it is boring as heck. But anyway, thank you very much. You're welcome.